We give up our lives for a stranger who's next to us in a trench.
The mother knows for sure that it's her child, but the father cannot be certain.
All those women insisting the baby looks like the father because he may not actually be the father. We're about halfway between a classic monogamous primate and a polygamous one. We're weird. We're a strange species. If you're a country invaded by somebody 10 times your size and the odds are so against you, hatred is a pretty understandable thing at that point. We are savaging and destroying you because you're our little brothers who we want to bring back home. How screwed up is that? There's reasons to be optimistic in the Ukrainian situation.
Good morning, friends. Today is a truly special day for our podcast. We have an unbelievable guest. Yes, it's difficult to believe, but Robert Sapolsky, the Robert Sapolsky from Stanford, kindly agreed to join us for a conversation. If you don't know, Robert Sapolsky is an American researcher and author of many popular books, such as Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, Determined, a Science of Life Without Free Will, is scheduled to be released in October 2023. He's a professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University. You might know him, most of the people know him for a series of lectures which are now public, or at least for a short lecture on depression. Science of depression is arguably the best take on depression I've ever heard in my life. He's just brilliant with respect to science of depression and human behavior in general. He's a professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University. His research is focused on stress, neuronal degradation, and gene therapy strategies to protect vulnerable neurons from diseases. He also studies wild baboons in Kenya to understand stress sources in their environment and how personality relates to stress-related diseases. In this podcast, we will focus on science of us versus them in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we will discuss how family ties, how bonds between family members, loved ones, can be impacted under an extreme stress such as war. So welcome, the one and only Professor Robert Sapolsky. Good morning, Professor Sapolsky. How are you doing?
Good. Good morning. Thanks for having me on this.
It's our pleasure. So you've already spoken on different topics related to your research and books, and I don't want to overlap with other conversations and podcasts and talks you've given. So I want to focus on something very specific, and the basic idea for me is to try to tap into a new area, or let's say new for us. So there is this romantic view of the war that it might bind people, that it might create some sort of feeling of unity. And let's say I was thinking that maybe it's a little bit too romantic, and in reality, war destroys everything, and it also destroys relationship between people. That's why I wanted to talk to you about what biology has to say about relationship between people, between family members, between loved ones and members of one community and the same species under the extreme stress such as war. So the basic philosophy of today's conversation, I want to start with generic mechanisms, biological mechanisms which bond people together to understand what are the mechanisms behind, and then we will work progressively towards human species as as the whole. So it's let's say it's ambitious, but let's do our best to work our way from the very basic level of mother-child relationship. So just tell us briefly, how does a mother know that it's her child, and how can a mother identify her child among other children, and what are the mechanisms which bind them together?
Great question. And the answer is it depends on what species we're talking about. If we're talking about humans, primates, if we're talking about rodents, and so on, when you get to the species that are far from we primates, identifying a relative, identifying a child is quite easy in that it's hardwired. It's innate among rodents. It's done with pheromones. It's done with pheromonal signatures that are derived from somebody's sort of genetic signature, mostly in their antibody generating genes. And you come up with your distinctive pheromonal signature, which bears a fair amount of similarity to someone with whom you share half your genes, and less so with someone with whom you share a quarter of your genes, and so on down the line. So there's automatic recognition, and sufficiently so that you can take a lab rat who is a full sibling of another rat. They happen to be from two separate litters, so they've never met, all of that, and they can recognize their full siblingship right off the bat. And you see something similar with primates who have something convenient going on, which is when they spend their whole life in the same group. Because if you don't go anywhere, you've got a pretty good sense of who your siblings are, who your first cousins are, and so on. And what you see is things like how much time a baboon, a female baboon, will spend grooming other baboons decreases as a function of, this is my mother or child or full sibling to cousin, and so on, that they're operating with that. And then you get to us, and of course the problem is that we're way too smart, and we're way too free of any given sensory modality. We are not run by olfactory signatures. We are not run by electric fish recognizing each other by their electrical patterns, things of that sort. We have to think about it. And we have to think through things like what symbols, what signals you're using to decide if somebody is an us or a them. When it comes to mother-infant, that's about as straightforward as you can get, in terms of biological certainty. This is the child I gave birth to. But the fact that we can have people who have adopted a child and feel as desperately in love of them, with them, as they would with a biological child, shows it's something more complicated than, oh, I went through labor to produce you, so that's why I'm feeding you. There's all sorts of additional stuff coming in. But in terms of the amount of uncertainty of relatedness that could come in because of adultery, cheating on pair bonds, because of the uncertainty that could come in because of how strongly we identify with sort of cultural relatives, things like that, there's nothing more straightforward than a mother-infant bond.
You mentioned one word, cheating, and it just dragged me towards thinking, does it work the same way for parenthood? Because, well, we know that sometimes there might be issues in the families and the child can be brought from elsewhere, and the father would still dedicate all of his life, all of his efforts to the child.
Yep, absolutely. It's showing we're not like most vertebrates. We don't distribute our, altruistic and affiliative behavior along strict lines of genetic, relatedness. That, yeah, we give up our lives for a stranger who's next to us in a trench. We use our resources to adopt a child from the other side of the planet. we marry into a family and take on the responsibilities, and yeah, we're more complicated, and that produces moments of wonderful altruism, and that produces moments of like total horror as humans.
Just to develop a little bit further of the differences between how a father perceives a child and a mother perceives a child. As you said, for a mother, it's all quite straightforward. The mother knows for sure that it's her child, but the father cannot be certain. I'll also speculate. So since we are, adults, and we can say something that might sound obscene, but I was just wondering your opinion about that there is speculation that the shape of human penis is such that it sort of pumps out all the semen that was there from a previous partner. So meaning that it's still not clear if we are a monogamous species or not. So my question is it really true that men harbor naturally doubts about really being biologically fathers of our child, and we need a little bit more time and maybe a little bit more certainty? So it might sound a bit sexist in this era of political correctness, but again, we are doing it not for a political agenda, just for the sake of science. Therefore, can you basically confirm or deny that this is actually true? And those doubts, can they evolve with time? So, for example, maybe some stressful events can change the father's opinion, or as you said before, unlike other animals, the cognition plays a super important role in our bonding. So, and since it's a cognition, we can be tricked into believing that it's our child, or can it also be the other way around? Can a father lose its bonding to its child, offspring, etc.?
Well, as is always the case with humans, sort of the support for each of these ideas is there, but it's not incredibly strong. We are not ruled by any given one of these sort of parameters. So in this particular realm, the other week I saw this great paper from an evolutionary psychologist. This was a study of mothers in Canada, and by a huge, huge margin, much, much more than 50% of women said their baby looked more like the father than the baby looked like them. We immediately see sort of combating paternity uncertainty kind of thing. Wow, that makes total sense. That's really interesting. And then there's a paper from a Mexican population showing none of that tendency whatsoever. Okay, so maybe it isn't a real phenomenon, or it's a real one, but it's not that strong, and it's very culture specific, all of that. As another example, interestingly, again from Canada, some classic studies looking at patterns of child abuse. And what they showed is, big surprise, fathers are more likely to be abusers of children than are mothers. Stepfathers are more likely to be than biological fathers. Paternal grandfathers are more likely to be than maternal grandfathers. With paternal grandfathers, there's 2 steps of uncertainty. With maternal grandfathers, there's only one. And this whole beautiful finding with this, and this couple in Toronto made their career on this, and then a bunch of Swedish attempts at replication of that have failed, and showed it was very confounded by the fact that if you have a stepfather in a family rather than a biological father, you're likely to be poorer on the average. And that introduces elements of economic stress and displacement aggression from that. So, yeah, all of these pieces are there. And then you see a human giving up their life for a stranger, or a family where between the marriage pattern and the adoption pattern, the family represents 3 different races or things like that. And, we're not constrained. All of these are only tendencies in us, meaning, hooray, we're a smart species. Hooray, by most of the parameters of primate social evolution, we wind up somewhere in the middle. We're not one of those, and we're not one of those. And as you bring up our reproductive anatomy and physiology and social organization and patterns of genetic diseases and all of that show that we're about halfway between a classic monogamous primate and a polygamous one, a South American marmoset monkey or a chimp or a baboon. So it's incredibly interesting that on the average, we're right there in between. And it's equally interesting that we're right there in between in the middle on the average. And different individuals obviously are at very different points on that continua and have physiology going along with it. What that shows is there's no uniform picture. It's incredibly malleable to cultural factors. It's incredibly malleable to psychological manipulation, like all those women insisting the baby looks like the father because he may not actually be the father, that sort of stuff. And that's where humans don't fit any of the easy categorizations about sort of us and the evolution of our behavior.
And are you aware of any study that shows some sort of mechanisms which will split people or which will make people feel like they are not a family anymore after a stressful event or anything like this? That's one of the things that I want to clarify, how stress impacts feeling of family connection and just feeling caring for each other. So meaning under stress, do we really bind more or we feel more isolated and more selfish and trying to survive and abandon our loved ones?
I think we become a lot more selfish, and your part of the world has shown that. The pandemic has shown that, all of that, amid obviously there being huge exceptions, but it's an interesting pattern. What you see is during times of stress, our capacity for empathy gets smaller. Our capacity for who counts as an us gets smaller, all of that. But the typical pattern is it compresses down into family or the closest of your culture and those who you share cultural symbols with it. It's rare that it breaks down like further than that. That really does become the unit of how you're now viewing the world. What it does at the same time, though, is it typically exaggerates whatever pathology there is within a family in terms of functioning, because a time like that just is reifying, is strengthening the foundations of whatever logic or illogic emotionally that the family is running on. So it's absolutely common that like one's concerns collapse down to being very, very local, but that usually stops at the family. I mean, I was fascinated. There's a whole string of like leaders of African independence in the middle of the 20th century, all the various colonies where they all started off as Pan-Africans. We are going to form one gigantic country. And by the time it looked like their country was going to get independence, their main concern was that. And then 10 years later, in their rule emerging as a dictator, they were only concerned about their tribe. And in their last 10 years of life as an 80-year-old ruthless murderer, all they cared about was making sure that their children were running the poaching trade for elephant tusks. And like, that's the sort of compression that you see. There were not a whole lot of them who were turning over their family members to the international court. I think things collapse down. Family is kind of a unit that remains intact there. Where you see exceptions to that were like these horrifying documented cases of like children, World War II or just before, Polish-German kids who were of mixed marriage, and some Nazi pseudo genetics expert determined that this kid didn't have too much Polish blood, so you can let them live. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to take them from their Polish parents, and we're going to raise them in Germany, and we're going to raise them Hitler Youth and all that sort of thing, and teach them to, among other things, think of Poles as subhuman. And there were at least a handful of cases where after the war, they were able to identify this teenager was one of the ones who was 10 years old, was kidnapped from Warsaw and raised, and we know who the family is, and we're returning them. And as you can imagine, just staggering psychological dissonance when being told that German-speaking woman making great pastries for you, she really wasn't your mother, and this is your mother. And she's been looking for you all these years, and she is part of this group that you have just been spending your time being indoctrinated into despising. Yet she knows you, and she can tell you where your birthmarks are, and like enormously psychologically disruptive all around, because, you know, a lot of what makes who matters to you feel close to you is a lot of the baggage that comes with kinship, but is not guaranteed to come with kinship and can be dissociated. On the other hand, then you get those stories about like identical twins who were separated at birth and they were raised in completely different worlds, or there was a mistake in the hospital and two babies were switched and all of that. And they discover this as 40-year-olds, and they've been raised completely differently from their biological parents. And yet they claim, you know, this is the first time they have felt at home in this way. We're weird. We're a strange species. It's guaranteed that some cases of put your child on a train going west in the hope that they'll be safe, and maybe 2 years later when it's all over, they come back and nothing will have been changed whatsoever. In fact, it will have been strengthened. And in some cases, it will have been irreparably damaged. And it's hard to predict. And it's part of the disaster that what's going on in Ukraine is all about, because there's all sorts of these kids scattered outside of Ukraine now, and with families broken up. Much as in the United States, when we take an immigrant family that comes over the border from Mexico and we separate the kids from the parents and put them in different detention centers. And then in like 2,000 cases here, at least, people lose the paperwork saying who belongs to who. And so what this does, it's obviously never a good thing. And there's going to be tremendous variability as to what the outcome is if and when the world goes back to normal and families are reunited, sort of remnants of families being reunited after the Holocaust had no shortage of stories of people who had remarried by then, assumed whoever had died, and complexities with that, or sheer distance. Wow, you got out, and I just spent the last 3 years in a concentration camp, and during that time we became strangers to each other, even though, and there's a whole range of responses, but I think there's reasons to be optimistic in the Ukrainian situation. For one thing, it's the 21st century, so someone's far away and you can Zoom with them. You can talk to them every day, every night, and like know what their daily activities are in their Hungarian school that they're in now, or they're like refugees in Singapore or something. Technology makes an enormous difference. I mean, this is an era where people can fall in love with each other just online, and they don't even know what they smell like. You can fall in somebody or other, and you don't know what their pheromones are like. There's no primate in history who could ever make sense of this. So technology has allowed things to remain tighter in that regard. I think another big advantage for the Ukrainian situation is these are not people escaping from Vietnam after the communist takeover in the 1970s who got on a boat and managed to wind up in some other country, and maybe the US felt responsible and eventually took them in, and here they are in a completely different culture on the other side of the country. It's another Eastern European culture in most of these cases. And as another, I think, key issue, I mean, there were all, I don't know how much this was the case in Ukraine, but these horror stories in the press here. Okay, everybody's rushing west out of Kyiv and getting on the trains there and winding up in Poland, and they're welcomed with open arms and helping them and all of that. And then you read a story about like a Nigerian graduate student who was in Ukraine studying and was part of getting out of there and was on the same train. And at the border, they're not getting treated very well. They're probably not going to be, oh, good. So it's in countries that are officially welcoming you in, rather than meeting you at the border with like barbed wire or fire hoses or things like that, that they would be doing if you were taking a boat from Tunisia trying to get into Italy or something. So I think between the technology, the cultural similarities, and the fact that the whole world is, with the exception of a couple of those countries to your east, the whole world is welcoming in Ukrainian refugees. And what that often means is respecting the culture and trying to make sure they still have contact with, Ukrainian culture, doing everything possible to make the eventual reuniting as successful as it can be. I think this is about as optimistic as you can get.
Yeah, that was a great answer. And to be honest, I expected a much more pessimistic view.
Me too. But, look at what happens to people like coming in here in the U.S. from Central America, and you realize what counts as the average welcome for a refugee is so awful that Ukrainian refugees are getting a pretty loving acceptance. And that's going to make a difference, amid it obviously being horrible.
Let's hope for that. Let's hope for the positive outcome. One nuance. So I was thinking of such a phenomena as feeling resentment. Ukrainian refugees are escaping a man-made disaster. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon. So there is a human actor. There are bad actors behind the situation. And it clearly speaks to us in a different way than running away from a hurricane or running away from flooding, whatever, because then, it just happened because, nature is evil or something like this. It's very different when you perceive that there is a human, an evil human that created this misery compared to just an unfortunate situation. So this feeling of resentment can eat people from inside and create long-lasting PTSDs and these sort of things. Are there any, I don't know, I don't want to say advice, but maybe some practical tools, I don't know. Maybe there is something that can mediate or lower the impact of this resentment, that there are evil humans behind the situation.
Well, I sure don't know an easy answer for that. What you're emphasizing is incredibly important to people who study PTSD. Completely random natural world, completely random and unintentionally caused by a human, intentionally caused by a human, intentionally caused by a human with you in mind specifically, is this whole hierarchy that you get. 20 years ago or something, there was this disaster of a hurricane in the United States, Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed most of the city of New Orleans. And like thousands of people drowned in the flooding and all of that. And what became clear after a while, New Orleans is one of the most racially divided cities in the United States. And that, of course, is along lines of wealth and poverty and crime and all of that. And basically what happened is the U.S. government sent in buses for the white people to get them out of there. Or if you were at all wealthy, you had a car and you could get out of there. And they did essentially nothing for the poor Black neighborhoods, which were the ones where all the deaths were and the disaster and all of that. And people, sort of trauma people studying it afterward, made the correct conclusion that what went on there was a human-made intentional disaster. It wasn't the hurricane, because you looked at the rates of PTSD just outside of New Orleans on either side that were exposed to the same hurricane and all of that. And it was in the wards where there was utter, clear, obvious evidence that the government didn't care. And at some point they said, nah, let's not bother sending buses for those people. And that was the PTSD rates after that were unlike anything you normally see after a hurricane, because the trauma there wasn't from a hurricane. It was from what was done. So a brilliant way of differentiating them. The last thing on earth I'm in a position to do, because what I know about are rats and baboons, and because I'm not a clinician, and because I'm sitting here in my comfortable home in California, like as far from this reality as possible. But not all of those Russian soldiers are murderous convicts who like signed up with the Wagner group. Not all of them like want to be there. Not all of them have a clue what this is and are terrified, and whose mothers are sick to their stomachs back there. And amid the horror, I guess something that might be buffering in some ways is if one of them is a monster, it's because higher up in the hierarchy, the culture was established saying it is okay for you to be a monster in this circumstance. And we know what's at the top of that hierarchy is Putin. So on this total, like, yeah, I can talk this way. Somebody in the bombed out remnants of their home in southeastern Ukraine would have trouble thinking this way. But any of those Russians who are monsters, it's been because they're in a system that made it painful enough for them that this is who they became. And, their cousins, like everyone I run across has, like, who's Russian has a cousin in Ukraine, or whose sister married somebody from Moscow and they're in Kyiv. And like, of course, there's massive amounts of overlap. And maybe that's grounds for like somehow remembering you have really, really terrible, shitty circumstances that has just been a disaster for your life. But the people doing this to you are doing it because they've had some pretty disastrous circumstances also. As always, the truly evil people in power operate by turning people against each other who have nothing against each other, instead of noticing who's actually responsible. But again, obviously that's me for sitting here and, I practically sound like some idiot Buddhist monk or something, in terms of how to get past what they've done to you, to your country, your home, your family, all of that. But most of them are in some way victims of the same monstrosity who's directing this whole thing.
Yeah, we'll come back to the system which conditioned them to do that a little bit later. But for the moment, let's also speak a little bit about us versus them, and how the soldiers are triggered into bonding with their brothers in arms and differentiate them from us. And you already spoke about that in previous talks. So I'll just want to recap that you mentioned that the easiest way to trick the soldiers is to trigger disgust in brain's insula. But then I noticed a paradox. if you create this feeling of disgust and you just want to eliminate rats or cockroaches or whatever, at the same time, there are phenomena such as rape and napping children. Don't you see a paradox? How can you at the same time feel disgust towards them, but mate with their women and steal their children?
Well, first thing is sexual violence has nothing to do with sex. It has nothing to do with reproduction. It has to do with violence and dominating and terrorizing and things of that sort. So I think that really has to be evaluated in a different category. In terms of like taking their children, I think it's both in sort of both the United States and Canada and Australia had at various points historically taking children away from the native indigenous populations. And that was out of wonderful Christian care and all of that, so that you don't grow up as a savage and you grow up Christian and you could be sort of a very low-ranking member of our white society. And in the process, we're also committing cultural genocide. The surest way to end you people, if it gets tiring shooting you, is to make sure you have no next generation to pass it on to. So in some ways, like that's a logical thing to do, but it's not killing those kids. It's bringing them back and raising them as your own. And I think this is, in a sense, adding to the insult. It's your child, while we burn down your Polish village with our Panzer tanks, your child will learn to salute Hitler. Think about that just before we shoot you. Or the ways in which, like, the Russians, centuries of like Russian Orthodox saints stuffed into churches or whatever, and Russian Revolution, it overthrows all of that. It's a whole new world. And what do they do at the end? They take Lenin and they stuff him. They put him on display like he's some sort of Slavic saint. And what are they saying? We're the ones now. If you want to come and see who your saint is now, stuffing on displayed under a glass case, it's going to be Lenin. It's not going to be Saint whoever from like the Vlad the Impaler's reign or some such thing. It's English phrase, it's pissing on their territory. It's degrading it symbolically. It's your children will be singing our national anthem. Your children would be disgusted by you. We're going to guarantee it. So I think it's that element. But in terms of this whole thing, us and them and disgust and the insula and all of that, Ukraine is a weird situation. I mean, us, them explained a ton about various genocides of native populations. Us, them explained the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust or whatever, or the United States and Japan at war, two cultures from the other side of that. Like half of what Russia's propaganda is there's no such thing as Ukrainians. You're really one of us. You're really our kind. This weird, stupid Ukrainian language, well, we've been trying to convince you for 200 years that it's not legitimate. And now this silliness you're saying about this being your own country, that's not legitimate. And you saying, oh, we're Western oriented. No, you're Slavs. It's a weird, we are savaging and destroying you because you're our little brothers who we want to bring back home. How screwed up is that cycle? It's a very different. I mean, Putin could maintain only for so long that Ukraine was being terrorized by like Nazis, like Zelensky. That one's a little hard to explain, but that Russia was going in to liberate our fellow Slavs from this abnormality that has declared it a country of its own. But yeah, as soon as like atrocities in Bucha and places like that started appearing, it was obvious this was not going in to liberate our little cousins. But still, it's not just, Crimea really is ours, so we're taking it back. It's you people are really us. And mind you, when you get back to being us after we win the war, you're going to get the shittiest deal possible. You're going to be us way at the bottom of that. But you're us. This is us just reclaiming extended family, which is what's so weird about this, and that it's part of like the aftermath of the Soviet Empire collapsing and sort of the historical shame for someone like Putin. But also coupled with, wow, if it was the 19th century, we were trying to keep Ukrainians from speaking their language. And wow, if it was the 18th century, they were probably like defeating, Peter the Great in some battle or other by teaming up with the Swedes. And this is not getting on a boat to the other end of the world and trying to kill the people there. This is a weird one.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very interesting case that I spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to wrap my head around. Did they actually, break this dichotomy of us and them? And my understanding is, I'll share my opinion. So I actually talked to one Russian a while ago, and he mentioned something like, he called someone Russian, some random people, although for me, that person wouldn't be Russian. And I said, okay, why are you calling that person Russian? Like, who are the Russians, right? Like, and then he basically said, whoever speaks Russian and lives there, things like this. And then I realized that, in fact, the problem is not only the Soviet Union, it goes way back. And let's say the number of cultural memes in Russia are such that they might be innocent by themselves. So, for example, Putin keeps saying Russia doesn't have borders. Okay, and this idea exists in Russia. Yeah, okay, it's not nice not to have borders, but it doesn't sound that, dangerous. And then they say, they don't clearly know who Russians are. If you speak Russian, then you are Russian. And there's like, but yeah, what is Russian? Then you would say, okay, any Slavic language is Russian, and then you can claim that anyone is Russian and this sort of thing. So not having clearly defined who you are it's a dangerous idea, because I realized I've been to Russia once, and I noticed that it's actually it's a tough world. So my understanding is that the circle who they defined us is very small, might be just like your family. So you have this very tiny cell of your family that you identify them as really us, and everybody else is not you. And then you have this image of really them, Americans or whoever, is far away and super evil and wants you dead or something like this. So you have this image of this enemy somewhere far, and everybody who is in between. And actually it's not only Ukraine. I would also say, the Baltic states fall in the same category. So Central Asia, whatever Russia can potentially extend its influence towards, they are potential sort of gray zone us. So it's an interesting, it's a weird situation. And it's a result of a long history. It's a result of many conditions. And as you mentioned already, that those soldiers, the war criminals, were conditioned to commit the crimes, that they didn't really have a free will to do it. It just, they were in a situation and they did it. And it's a result of countless previous situations or conditions or factors which influenced them, triggering them.
Absolutely. You read things like, if the newspapers are accurate, that the draft in Russia is way disproportionately taking young men from the outer republics, the ones who aren't ethnic Russian, the ones who are from Chechnya or Tuva, Tuva. They're Mongolian. Like you see pictures of people in Tuva and they're like, and oh yeah, they can get drafted into the Russian army and sent to fight in like Eastern Ukraine. And those are the ones being sent there. Like during the Vietnam War in the United States, the American military was overwhelmingly Black soldiers with poor educations from the poorest parts of the country, where they said, we'll give you a job. Go kill Vietnamese. And where the psychological distance, the sense of, and if you're good, we'll pay for you to go to college afterward so you can really like get ahead in life, because right now you hardly count as one of us. Like, yeah, this war is being fought mostly by Russian soldiers from the non-Russian republics there.
Right, but we want to be absolutely clear that this fact that they didn't have free will in no way can be, an alibi in the court and say, I'm not guilty of those crimes. Now, those people did commit war crimes and they have to be, held responsible for their war crimes. So I want to link it to your upcoming book. If I'm not mistaken, it's going to be released soon, right, in October. So tell us a tiny bit more about your upcoming book and what conclusion can we draw knowing that there is no free will and people were conditioned to commit their war crimes. So can I say that people who actually conditioned the criminals to commit crime are as responsible or even more responsible for the crime than people themselves? And in this particular case of Russia, I can think of, many cultural memes or, elements of culture, elements of propaganda. Propaganda is obvious, but it's now. Propaganda is happening now. There are clear messages that Ukrainians are Nazis, go to, kill Nazis. Nazis of fascists, it doesn't mean anything. It's just way to say, they are bad people. It's the same as calling rats or cockroaches or anything. Just, feel disgust towards the Nazis and go and kill them. But at the same time, I can think of the Russian culture, things which come to my mind would say, Dostoevsky. I found a quote of one of Dostoevsky's friend who described him as mean, corrupt, and full of jealousy. If you read Dostoevsky, he never tried to teach kindness and humanity to mankind. Instead, he asserted that morality is relative and you can decide for yourself what's wrong, what's right. I think it's a very dangerous thing, right? I mean, if you live in civilized society, you could read it for fun. You could watch some horror movies. Yeah, why not? I mean, right? But I think there is a fine line, right? And then I also find it interesting that Pushkin wrote on Polish uprising, which Russian propaganda is using right now against Ukraine. So you basically replace Poland with Ukraine and you say, he literally said, France, in that case, he used France. France needs to stay away. They need to leave us alone because this is a dispute between the Slavs and only Slavs can decide. So this is our zone of influence. We will take care of it. You stay away. And so Pushkin, he is respected in Russia, but now he is used by the official propaganda. And I would claim that he conditioned people in the past because they read it in school. They are, those war criminals, they go to whatever primary school and they read this innocent poem that says, this is our zone of influence. And then 20 years later, they are in Ukraine and they feel that they are entitled to, let's say, they are doing something, again, innocent. They are Russian soldiers and their job is to be a military police. They have to, I don't know, they are responsible for the order in the occupied town. But what right do they have to stop Ukrainian civilians and check their possessions? They are the occupiers. But this poem might condition them into believing that they have a moral right to establish order in a Slavic country, because Pushkin in 1930 said that Russians have a moral right to settle dispute between Slavic people. And you can go, deeper in history. The Russian political structure was inherited from the Golden Horde. One might claim that, they had this head of state, which would assign a leader to a local province, and you have this vertical of power, and local tribes were extremely aggressive and fighting for honor, that you had to prove yourself. You need to show to everybody else that you are strong and dominant. So, and you can go even back then. So my question to you, where do we draw the line? So first of all, can we claim that we do absolutely need to punish people responsible for the propaganda, people who conditioned soldiers into doing the war crimes? And how deep into history should we go to look for the root cause?
Well, the trouble is root causes just keep going further and further down. So it's very hard to say this is where this began. If you take that sort of perspective, which on one hand is difficult, but on the other, it's accurate. I mean, it intellectually is really how things work. This is like, it's one thing to be like some stupid professor in California who could talk about punishment doesn't make any sense and reward doesn't make any sense because none of us are truly responsible for our actions because of genes and environment and hormones and all of that. But then you get people who are running these atrocities and who are commanding them and who are handing out medals for it and who are running the propaganda and all of that. Somewhere in there, one has to reconcile, it's not their fault either. I bet their father was a drunkard who beat them every day when they came home, where, yes, this didn't come from nowhere. Nonetheless, you have to construct a world in which people are safe from them. And it's not every culture, society on earth that could be like Norway when they had that guy Anders Breivik who gunned down 70 people on that island out of white supremacy ideology. And he's basically lives in a fairly nice apartment inside a prison. He can't go out, but he's perfectly comfortable. And like, if he wants to get a book or a movie or whatever, they get it for him. He's taking college. He's enrolled as a college student in University of Oslo right now, taking long distance classes and all. Like, that's pretty amazing. That's a society that is able to say it's not by chance that he wound up the way he was, and he had a pretty screwed life, and he's never going to be able to do that again. And it takes a fairly privileged society to be able to do that. Western Europe, right after Berlin fell, was not in a position to be privileged and decide the Nazi leadership, we really need to understand they didn't get that way by accident. Some countries, some people have more of a luxury to focus on it's not by chance they became that way. You have to be damaged to be that damaging of a person. That's great. On the other hand, the biggest priority is they can't have the power to ever do something like that again. And if part of what will keep other people from repeating it is seeing that these guys got punished, that probably needs to be part of the equation as well. And it's going to be a long, long time before the really pressing need is for veterans of the Ukrainian army, when they're old men and women, and veterans of the Russian army to eventually meet and embrace and say, I have no hatred for you. That's great. That'll be wonderful in 40 years. Right now, it's whatever it takes to stop what's being done because of massive suffering. Eventually down the line, think about was this poor Chechenian where this was their chance to get out of prison, and they were in prison because they had no opportunities in life. They had a drunken, violent father and whatever. Does that kind of explain why they wound up doing war atrocities in Ukraine? Okay, that's going to be interesting down the line. right now, it's whatever it takes to just stop it. And sometimes, unfortunately, something that gives part of the power to trying to stop it is hatred. And, if you're a country invaded by somebody 10 times your size and the odds are so against you, hatred is a pretty understandable thing at that point. There'll be chances to understand, like, the biology of where hatred comes from and why it may be irrational and how it's due to propaganda and all of that down the line. Right now, you got a country to save with enormous numbers of innocent people who are like massively suffering. So I think there's room for philosophy, and there's room for the areas of philosophy that neuroscience has conquered and taken over. But in your part of the world, the most pressing thing is just how to get this to stop.
I would add not only to stop, but to make sure that it's not going to repeat in the future. That's why I made references to, the cultural memes. For me, it's not really a matter of philosophy. It's a matter of identifying the culprits. And for me, Dostoevsky and Pushkin are one of them. So I just wanted to mention them because just reconciliation and just hugging and feeling, a surge of oxytocin in 40 years when you hug Russians will not help if those Russians will keep reading the same cultural memes, which will make the next generation criminals or in 3 generations or whatever. So this is that's why it was more or less a practical question to try to understand all of those preconditions. Your upcoming book, to say, can we read it and learn to narrow down, to focus, to identify the culprits, the preconditions for aggression, for war crimes?
I think so. I hope so, because my basic stance in it is I am way, way at the extreme in terms of this, and that I think there is no free will whatsoever. And what we mistake for free will is looking only in this moment, or is relying on areas of ignorance. We don't know yet how to explain where that is, but the second science shows us how that works. It's not free will anymore. It's a mutation. It's a hormonal effect in the brain. It's a whatever. And when you look at it, if you have the luxury of really being able to think this way, instead of having to be a refugee or wondering where your next meal is coming from or anything like that. But when you take this to its logical conclusion, you see that we are nothing more than the biology that brought us to this moment, over which we had no control, and its interaction with environment, over which we had no control. And that is why we are who we are now. And if you really logically believe that, you're not entitled for anything more than anyone else because you have not earned it. You are not more worthy of consideration than anyone else because you have not earned that either. Every bit of the way, it has simply been the luck that you have had, that no matter how much Putin is doing what he is doing, at the end of the day, it makes no more sense to hate a person than to hate an earthquake or to hate a volcano, because it's as much an end product over things that made that person who they are, that they ultimately had no control over. But at the same time, dangerous people shouldn't be allowed to go and be damaging. At the same time, cars whose brakes are not working anymore should be kept off the road. At the same time, even though someone who is doing surgery on your brain is really, really skillful and gets paid a lot for it, they're not a better person than anyone else is because of it. But nonetheless, you should have competent people doing brain surgery instead of just picking people at random. Like, dangerous people need to be kept from harming each other. Competent people need to be doing the things that really need to be done competently. But nobody has earned more or less regard for their well-being than anybody else has, just because they turned out this way instead of that way.
And talking about the root cause of this violence or hatred, which you mentioned, what biology says about the default strategy or default program of those humans which lived 1 million years ago on savannas of Africa? Is it known what was their default? Because I read in Harari's book that later societies, so I don't know, dozens of thousands years ago, they chose different strategies regarding level of violence in their society. So there were more peaceful societies, more aggressive. Do you know what was the default program of the prehistorian or all those humans who came from Africa?
Well, it's a hugely controversial topic, and it's the weirdest thing to see a bunch of anthropologists fighting with each other viciously, practically hitting each other over questions about where does peace come from, which is like fairly absurd. But the basic debate is, have humans been this violent ever since we at last had a shared ancestor with chimpanzees 6 million years ago? Or is violence and hierarchy and all of that a relatively recent human invention, like in the last 20,000 years? And I am of the view that that is overwhelmingly the case. When you look at the paleontological record, you do not see mass killings until there were sedentary societies, people living on top of a controlled resource. Mobile nomadic hunter-gatherers, you don't have organized warfare. You don't have massacres, things of that sort. You look at contemporary hunter-gatherers, and you do not see warfare unless it is in order to protect themselves from outside colonial forces, forces taking their lands, things of that sort. You do not see genocide on that level until agriculture was invented, because what happened when agriculture was invented was suddenly you have surplus, and suddenly you have people getting different shares of the surplus, and you have socioeconomic status, and you have poverty, and you have all of that stuff. And that's where organized violence came. Amid that, you go and you study a bunch of hunter-gatherers in the middle of Botswana, and you spend enough time with them, and they will have the exact same murder rate as any Western European country when it comes to a man killing another man because he thinks he's doing something with his wife on the side or with his girlfriend or something. The exact same rates as violence one-on-one over things like sexual jealousy in every hunter-gatherers. That I suspect we've been doing for 5 million years at exactly the same rates. And all of these old pictures in anthropology of hunter-gatherers are the peaceful people and all. No, it's just because that anthropologist was looking at a band of 40 people, and he would have to watch them for 45 years to get as much interactions as goes on in a major European city in one afternoon. But as there got to be enough of those data, you would see, oh yeah, guys will decide their wives are cheating on them and come home and beat them to death in the same rate in the middle of the Kalahari Desert as they do in London or whatever. That's been there forever. But whole groups of men putting aside making a living from day to day because someone else will feed them because they're now in a thing called an army, stuff like that, that's only 10, 12,000 years old. And it doesn't happen until people stop being nomadic hunter-gatherers. So this is the long, long human history is not one of endless warfare. There's all sorts of people who endlessly argue for that, and they confuse hunter-gatherers with what are called forest horticulturalists, people who are doing a combination of hunting and agriculture and rainforest. And that's where you see the transition. That's when you start seeing organized violence. And this is not, humans have spent 99% of their history not yet having societal structures that generate organized violence. This is a really new thing.
I see. So probably this observation is a bit optimistic, that it means we can, in theory, overcome those horrible things we experience in modern times. Yeah. Professor Sapolsky, I also wanted to ask, because it's your area of expertise, since Bogdan asked before the psychological consequences of this stress, I also wanted to ask about chronic inflammation, because you study intensively this topic, and in one of your articles you mentioned that there is a long-term effect of enormous stress on development of chronic inflammation, and that there is approximately, you mentioned in one case, 6 years gap when this wave of chronic inflammation diseases comes. So I wanted to ask you, do we unfortunately observe the same? We will see an enormous wave of chronic inflammation and then linked diseases with it among Ukrainian population in future. And if yes, again, I don't know if it's possible, any practical tips, or would it be possible to do something with that? For example, I was thinking about things like changing diet or culture of cuisine, because, for example, if you have a lot of high-fat diet, then you worsen the situation with chronic inflammation. But if you, for example, change your habits towards more plant food, then somehow you could diminish the effect of chronic inflammations.
Well, I think you're right in both ways there. First, we're learning more and more that the long-term health consequences of stress involve inflammation, chronic inflammation, way more than anybody used to think. And that's been a little bit of a revolution. I don't know if you're familiar with glucocorticoid hormones.
Yeah, I did PhD on this.
Okay, there you go. So since the 1950s, everyone was raised, like every endocrinologist knew from the time that they were a baby, that glucocorticoids suppress inflammation. Glucocorticoids are immunosuppressive. That's totally amazing. We're giving out a Nobel Prize in the 1950s for that. Glucocorticoids are anti-inflammatory. And it has taken forever to figure out that glucocorticoids are anti-inflammatory when you use them in the pharmacological range, when they're using them at levels that are 10 times the binding affinity of glucocorticoid receptors, things like that. And amazing when you're looking, instead of pharmacological increases, you're looking at physiological over the course of normal stress and not. And in the mild to moderate stress range, glucocorticoids promote inflammation. Wow, exactly the opposite. I was a little bit in on that revolution of like dealing with that in the context of neuroinflammation. Oh my God, glucocorticoids and stress can make all sorts of aspects of brain damage worse. That makes no sense because they're decreasing inflammation. That makes no, actually, in all those circumstances, it turns out glucocorticoids are increasing inflammation. I remember I had a postdoc around 1998 or something who was coming, like what we always did was sit there and say, okay, so we know lots of stress and glucocorticoids are bad for the brain. But we also know inflammation is bad for the brain. And we also know that glucocorticoids are inhibiting inflammation. So they're bad in this way, but they're good in this way. So let's see, is this arrow stronger than this arrow? Let's do, and he was like my first inflammation person to come and started working on that. And like, I ruined the first year of his life in my lab because every time he came into my office and said, this is really weird. I'm seeing actually that the stress and glucocorticoids are increasing inflammation. I'm saying, oh my God, go back and check. You missed the test tubes. Oh, you please go do it again. And it took forever for me to realize that this was this whole shift going on around then. Stress in the everyday sense, elevated cortisol levels in the everyday sense are pro-inflammatory. And at the end of the world I care about, the brain, a huge amount of the degeneration during brain aging is being slowly pushed in one direction by the amount of neuroinflammation over the lifetime. Inflammation outside the nervous system turns out to have much, much more access to the brain than people used to think. So even inflammatory stuff by cardiovascular disease and obesity and things like that's increasing neuroinflammation. And that's really central to a lot of what goes wrong. So absolutely, inflammation as a mediator of everything that's been going on in Ukraine for the last year and a half, that's certainly going to be one of the pieces of problems for decades to come with health, problems in the children for decades to come, probably even in their children because of epigenetics. But at the same time, the interventions are exactly what you say. Most of these slow degenerative features of aging are incredibly sensitive to diet and exercise and antioxidants and anti-inflammatories and social support and lack of anxiety and treating depression and things of that sort. Alzheimer's disease currently, late onset Alzheimer's, not the type that people get in their 50s because it runs in their family, but the 90% of cases of Alzheimer's disease, 40% of the risk could be explained by lifestyle risk factors. Food, diet, exercise, smoking, head injuries, all of that. And that's turning out to be the range for most of these neurodegenerative features of aging. Yeah, terrible, terrible news. What's been going on, how stressful it is. There are a lot of spots where somebody can intervene. And most importantly, in terms of our bias towards high-tech medicine, it's not intervene after the damage has happened by going in with some amazing drug, but preventatively beforehand with everyday lifestyle stuff. We both got raised in believing the way to tackle disease is to find the mutation, or the way to tackle disease is to figure out the drug that will fix it. And more, what biological sciences are about is get there beforehand rather than afterward. And it's very rare that it's due to this mutation or this, methylation event or this, and instead it's due to 58 different lifestyle things, each of which contribute this much. And you put them all together, and a whole bunch of them you can address yourself, but you got to do it every day. And it's little stuff. And it's so much more satisfying to go to a doctor and they give you a drug that will fix it. And, all that stuff. But as soon as you get something as oh my God, Alzheimer's disease, amyloid plaques, dead neurons, we can show the molecular conformations of the twisted protein aggregates that are lifestyle. Half of your risk in that is built around how you've just lived your last 60 years. That's a very, very powerful observation that stop trying to find the one epigenetic effect that explains everything. And it's this big stuff. And what's very important to me in the process is that the sort of things you need that constitute a lifestyle that makes for less of this stuff building up damage over time also usually happens to make the world a much more gentle place to live in. So that's a win on both fronts.
I'll make a small advertisement of one of the first episodes actually that we recorded on this podcast. Most of our episodes are in Ukrainian, but we had an English-speaking guest who spoke on diabetes, and he spoke a lot about lifestyles. That's why I recall that. Unfortunately, the conclusion was that it's almost impossible to convince people to change their diet. He works with patients and he tries to explain, look, you will lose your legs if you don't change your lifestyle. And they just keep eating, drinking sodas full of sugar and just keeps killing them slowly. So it's very sad, but we have a body of evidences that changing your habits, stop smoking, stop eating junk food, it looks so easy, but it's so hard.
I heard a lecture once by this guy who was an infectious disease guy who late in life was getting a whole change in attitude. And he was saying, you know what the single best finding that would be for human health right now? This would be as important as the polio vaccine or antibiotics or whatever. If somebody figured out why is it that when we feel like nobody loves us, we eat chocolate cake. Figure that one out, and you will have just done the biggest thing for health of anybody since like washing hands before surgery was figured out. Yeah, like that has something to do with it. That's crazy how much it has to do with it.
But at least options are there, so it's still optimistic, right? That there is always a solution. I think we can end on this positive note, maybe.
Is there any chance that in face of a global challenge such as climate change, we will all feel like us for the first time in human history?
I think here is where I run out of my ability to sound optimistic. I think things look pretty bad in that regard. Of course, as is usual, when the oceans come flooding in and the heat becomes intolerable and all of that, it's going to be the people who were already unlucky who are going to be feeling it first. Like Northern Europe has half a century ahead of it before it feels as bad as Pakistan does, that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't feel very optimistic in that realm at all. So there, I can't find any silver lining.
Let's finish on a pessimistic note then. Well, Professor Sapolsky, thank you so much for your time, and it was an important conversation, and I hope people will be informed about risks and maybe silver linings in the current situation. And I want to highlight the importance of you mentioned, social support. This is really, something a key. If you can take a pill for antidepressant, again, maybe it helps, but people shouldn't forget about, social connections and importance of family and these sort of things. And despite physical separations, we should all stay in touch. And fathers who are in Ukraine with kids abroad should try to talk to them regularly. And these sort of things, that was very important for me to hear from a specialist, because again, it's not just a simple advice. It's, supported by a body of scientific evidence. So let's hope that despite of the war, Ukrainian families stay strong and remember the importance of love and simply connecting to your loved ones.
Yeah. Well, I hope you guys get to go back home soon if that's what you want to do. I hope your families stay safe. I hope all this ends soon. It's a nightmare. It's heartbreaking.
Thank you, well, Professor Sapolsky.
Have a good middle of the day, and I'll go to bed now, and be well. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you, and good luck with your research. Bye.